There are moments in history when the impossible becomes legend, when courage meets destiny in a clash that reshapes how a civilization sees itself. One such moment came in the year 1274, on the mist-covered shores of Hakata Bay, when an empire that had conquered half the world met an island that refused to kneel. What unfolded that day wasn't merely a battle. It was the birth of a myth, forged by 80 men who stood against the might of the Mongols. In the autumn of 1274, the winds over the Tsushima Strait carried more than the scent of salt. They carried war. The Mongol Empire, under the command of generals serving the Yuan Dynasty, had launched a massive expedition across the sea. Their fleet darkened the horizon. Tens of thousands of soldiers from China, Korea, and the steppe, marching under the banner of Kublai Khan, the ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen. They came with confidence carved from centuries of conquest. But waiting for them on the shores of Hakata Bay was something they did not expect: a small band of Japanese samurai, barely 80 strong. It was an absurd mismatch. Yet what turned this hopeless stand into legend wasn't numbers, it was spirit. They mounted their horses, drew their blades, and charged straight into the Mongol lines. Against an army that had crushed kingdoms from Baghdad to Kiev, these men refused to yield an inch. Their defiance shocked the invaders. For the first time, the Mongols, masters of fear, were made to feel it themselves. That single encounter, brief yet blazing, became more than a battle. It became a symbol of Japan's soul, the unbreakable spirit of warriors who would rather die standing than live kneeling. Until that moment, the Mongol war machine had seemed unstoppable. But here, on this small island, a handful of fighters forced the world's most feared empire to hesitate. And that hesitation changed everything. Today, we'll uncover a story often overlooked: the first Mongol invasion of Japan, the battle that made Kublai Khan's armies taste defeat for the very first time, and how it transformed the image of the samurai into something eternal. When most people think of the Mongols, they imagine an unstoppable storm, horsemen thundering across the plains, conquering kingdoms in days. And for a time, that image was true. Under Genghis Khan and his descendants, the Mongols built a realm that stretched from Korea to Eastern Europe, swallowing empires whole. By the mid-13th century, one man stood above it all: Kublai Khan, born in 1215, grandson of Genghis himself. By 1260, he had risen to become Great Khan, the supreme ruler of the Mongol world. But Kublai's ambitions went beyond the steppe. He didn't just want to conquer, he wanted to govern, to create a dynasty that could rival China's great empires of the past. In 1271, he proclaimed the birth of a new dynasty, the Yuan, presenting himself not as a barbarian conqueror, but as a rightful Chinese emperor, heir to the Han and Tang. This was more than politics. It was a statement to the world. The Mongols were no longer outsiders. They were the new rulers of civilization. Yet ambition is a hunger that never rests. By then, Kublai controlled nearly all of East Asia, from the frozen borders of Mongolia to the steaming jungles of Vietnam. But there was one corner of the map that remained unconquered: Japan. To Kublai, that small island kingdom was more than a curiosity. It was a challenge and an insult. After all, how could the ruler of the world tolerate a neighboring land that refused to submit? Japan, though small compared to China, was strategically priceless. It sat just over 100 miles from Korea, a short sail for Mongol ships. Its independence made it both a tempting target and a potential threat. If Kublai could subdue it, he would secure his empire's eastern flank and claim dominance over the Pacific. If not, Japan would remain a wild card, a possible refuge for his enemies. Trade was another prize. Japan's merchants controlled access to sulfur, a vital ingredient in gunpowder, the new terror of warfare. The Mongols had already begun using Tetsuho bombs, ceramic grenades filled with sulfur-based powder that burst in fire and thunder. The Southern Song Dynasty, still resisting Mongol conquest in China's south, traded with Japan for this crucial resource. Capturing Japan would cut off that supply, crippling the Song and strengthening Kublai's own armies. And then there was legend. For centuries, travelers from the Silk Road had whispered of a mystical island called Zipangu, a land overflowing with gold. With his paper currency in China losing value, Kublai was desperate for real precious metals to stabilize his empire's economy. To him, conquering Japan was not just about glory, it was economic salvation. But perhaps most of all, it was about prestige. By the 1270s, Kublai Khan's dominion stretched from Hungary to the Pacific Ocean. Yet Japan stood apart, untouched. If he could bring even this island under his rule, it would seal his legacy as the emperor who completed what his grandfather began, a world united under the Mongol banner. In the Chinese worldview that Kublai had adopted, foreign states were expected to pay tribute to the emperor as a gesture of respect. Korea had done so. Several Southeast Asian kingdoms had done so. But Japan? They didn't even answer his letters. In the winter of 1266, a group of Mongol envoys set sail across the East China Sea, carrying with them a message that was equal parts diplomacy and threat. It was the infamous Mongol letter, polite on the surface, venomous underneath. It spoke of friendship, of peace, and mutual respect, but behind its graceful words was a warning. The world now belongs to the Great Khan. The letter boasted of Mongol rule over Goryeo and hinted that Japan would be wise to choose its next step carefully. When a second message arrived in 1268, demanding Japan's submission outright, the Kamakura shogunate, Japan's military government, gave no reply at all. That silence echoed louder than any insult. To Kublai Khan, it was not mere arrogance. It was rebellion against the Son of Heaven himself. But what kind of nation dared to ignore the most powerful empire on earth? To understand that, we need to look at Japan as it truly was, not as the Mongols imagined it. Unlike the great trading hubs of Asia, Japan was a world of its own. Isolated, yet thriving. Its fertile rice fields sustained a people who had little need for foreign merchants. At its heart, Japan was ruled not by emperors, but by warriors. The emperor still sat on the throne in Kyoto, but his power was mostly ceremonial. The real authority rested with the Kamakura shogunate, founded in 1192 and by the 13th century, firmly controlled by the Hojo clan, with Hojo Tokumune serving as regent, a man whose name would soon be written in the storms of history. This was the age of the samurai, warriors bound by Bushido, the code of loyalty, courage, and duty. In return for land or stipends, these men pledged their lives to their lords. But Japan was no centralized kingdom. It was a web of clans and provinces, each ruled by local samurai families. When danger came, such as rumors of a Mongol invasion, the shogunate did not summon a standing army. Instead, it called upon these local warriors who gathered under their banners to defend the homeland. It was not organization that held Japan together. It was honor, and that made all the difference. Culturally and militarily, the contrast between Japan and the Mongol Empire could not have been sharper. For the samurai, war was personal. Honor was won through skill, courage, and individual combat. A samurai might shout his name across the field, challenge an enemy one-on-one, and fight to the death before witnesses. To the Mongols, this was absurd, a waste of time. They valued efficiency, formation, and strategy over ritual. Yet while their methods differed, Japan's defenders fought with a ferocity that no empire could measure. Still, beneath this proud warrior spirit, Japan's political structure was fragile. The shogunate was under internal strain, and its experience in foreign diplomacy was minimal. Between 1266 and 1272, Kublai Khan sent no fewer than 6 embassies demanding submission. Each time, Japan's leaders responded with the same unshakable silence. Had Tokumune chosen negotiation, perhaps war could have been avoided. But his refusal, born from pride, faith, or fate, sealed what would come next. Kublai Khan would no longer ask. He would invade. By 1274, the Mongol conquest of the southern Song dynasty was nearly complete. China's vast wealth and its 100 million people now lay under Kublai's rule. From these resources, he drew soldiers, ships, and supplies for his next campaign, a maritime invasion unlike anything East Asia had ever seen. This wasn't a horde of horsemen charging across a steppe. It was a coalition army, meticulously assembled. Contemporary sources, such as the Yuan and modern historians, estimate the invading force number between 20,000 and 23,000 men, supported by around 900 ships. The army was a patchwork of cultures and tongues. Mongol cavalry veterans, Korean conscripts from Goryeo, and even Chinese soldiers, some loyal, others captured or defected from the fallen Song dynasty. For Korea, subjugated in 1259, this invasion was not a choice. Kublai had forced the Goryeo court to build ships, provide sailors, and serve as his eastern vanguard. By autumn, the fleet was ready. Drums thundered, sails snapped in the wind, and the greatest amphibious force Asia had ever seen began its crossing toward Japan. The first to face them were the warriors of Tsushima Island, a narrow strip of land lying between Korea and Japan. When the horizon darkened with Mongol sails, the island's small garrison stood ready. Only 80 samurai, under the command of So Sukakuni, the local governor. 80 men against 20,000. A ratio of nearly 250 to 1, the kind of odds that would sound like a cruel joke in any other story. Alongside them came farmers, fishermen, and townsmen who armed themselves with whatever they could find, spears, bows, even farm tools. They weren't soldiers. They were defenders of their homes. And they would fight until the last. When the two forces met, the differences in their ways of war were stark. Both armies rode into battle on horseback, but even their horses told two different stories. The Japanese samurai rode compact, sturdy Kiso horses, perfect for Japan's steep, uneven terrain. The Mongols, meanwhile, brought their famous steppe ponies, larger, stronger, bred for endurance and distance. Where the samurai prized ritual, the Mongols prized momentum. As the battle began, Japanese archers loosed their arrows in formal challenge, some tipped with whistling heads to announce the duel, a gesture of tradition. The Mongols responded not with ceremony, but with science. They advanced in loose, shifting formations, unleashing volley after volley in coordinated waves until the defenders were smothered beneath a rain of arrows. Precision and ritual on one side, tactics and domination on the other. Even their command structures mirrored the divide. The Japanese fought in independent war bands, each led by a clan leader, each seeking glory for his name. The Mongols fought as a single organism. Drums dictated movement. Archers, infantry, and cavalry acted in perfect rhythm. And from the decks of their ships, Mongol engineers unleashed weapons the Japanese had never seen before. Thunder bombs, the world's first gunpowder grenades, tore through the air. Ceramic shells filled with sulfur exploded in flashes of fire and smoke, shattering the calm of the island. Japanese chronicles like the Hachiman Gudokun described the horror of defenders who had never imagined war could sound like thunder. For the first time, gunpowder had come to Japan. The contrast extended down to their armor and weapons. Samurai wore oyuroi, lacquered scales bound with silk cords, light enough to move in, strong enough to deflect arrows. Their helmets were crowned with metal plates and flared neck guards, often paired with minpo masks that turned their faces into expressions of fearlessness. Their long yumi bows towered over them, reinforced with bamboo and horn, while their tachi swords gleamed like mirrors, sharp enough to cut through armor. The Mongols, meanwhile, wore lighter lamellar armor, layers of iron, leather, and silk built for speed and adaptability. Their composite reflex bows, crafted from horn and sinew, were smaller but far deadlier, capable of piercing armor at close range. They carried sabers, axes, and round shields, and their horses were often protected with leather barding, turning rider and mount into one armored weapon. The samurai brought ritual, precision, and unmatched craftsmanship. The Mongols brought coordination, discipline, and innovation. And on the shores of Tsushima, these two worlds collided, not just armies, but entire philosophies of war. The result would echo through centuries. November 4th, 1274. Before the dawn mist had even lifted, the sea itself seemed to tremble. On the dark horizon, the faint silhouettes of sails appeared, hundreds of them, rising like ghostly mountains over the waves. The people of Tsushima Island had no illusions about what was coming. The Mongols had arrived. By the time the first keels scraped the sand, it was barely past 2 in the morning. Fishermen's torches flickered in the distance. Temple bells tolled warnings across the hills. The defenders, barely 80 samurai and their retainers, mounted their horses, knowing they were riding toward death. At their head rode Sosukakuni, the island's governor, a man who understood that his duty was not to survive, but to stand. By 4 o'clock, the silence of the coast had shattered. The first clash of iron rang out across the shoreline, echoing like thunder between the cliffs. The samurai rode out in the fashion of their ancestors, proudly announcing their names, proclaiming their lineage, calling for single combat. For them, battle was a sacred act. Every strike, every arrow loosed, was an offering to honor itself. The scrolls of Takazuki Suenaga, who later fought on Kyushu, still depict this spirit, lone horsemen charging into overwhelming odds, arrows flying in deliberate rhythm, each rider seeking not survival, but memory. But the Mongols were not interested in duels or honor. They came as a machine of war, disciplined, methodical, terrifyingly modern. Their formations moved like clockwork, lines of archers loosing volleys in unison, infantry advancing behind walls of shields, catapults mounted on ships hurling iron and paper bombs over the shore. For the samurai, who had grown up hearing only the whistle of arrows and the ring of swords, the sudden roar of explosions was beyond comprehension. The air trembled. The sand erupted into clouds of smoke and flame. Horses screamed. Armor shattered. Men were thrown from their mounts, their world torn apart by fire from the sea. In that moment, Japan entered the age of gunpowder. Even now, archaeologists still uncover fragments of those bombs in the sands of Hakata Bay, silent witnesses to the first thunder that ever reached Japanese soil. Despite the horror, Sukakuni's men held their ground. They charged again and again into the Mongol ranks, cutting down any soldier who came too close. They rode through clouds of smoke, through the hiss of arrows, through fire itself. Each charge was a death sentence, yet they charged anyway. Local legends speak of a Hachiman shrine, dedicated to the god of war, that caught fire amid the chaos, its burning pillars collapsing as a storm of arrows rained from above. For the islanders, it was the clearest omen imaginable. Even their gods were being tested. The Mongols pressed forward in perfect coordination. Cavalry swept along the flanks. Archers fired over the heads of infantry, and from behind the front line, catapults continued to pound the beaches. The ground became a furnace of noise, hoofbeats, drums, explosions, screams. Still, the samurai refused to break. They fought shoulder to shoulder, forming small defensive circles that held the enemy back longer than anyone could have imagined. When one man fell, another stepped into his place. Every heartbeat bought another moment of resistance. As the hours passed, the Mongols adjusted their tactics, tightening the noose. The samurai were cut off from retreat, surrounded from all sides. Yet even then, no one surrendered. They fought on, their armor blackened with soot, their blades chipped and dull, their banners half-burned but still flying. By dusk, Sosukakuni had fallen, struck down while leading a final charge. His warriors followed him into legend. The last survivors were surrounded, their horses dead, their bodies pierced by arrows, yet they stood, unmoving, unyielding, until the end. When the Mongols counted the dead that night, they found no prisoners. Victory came at a cost that no report could hide. The Mongols had taken the beach, but their victory was soaked in blood. They had lost hundreds, maybe thousands, in a battle that should have been effortless. To the empire that prided itself on speed and domination, Tsushima was not a triumph, it was an omen. Yet their wrath did not end with the samurai. The island's civilians, farmers, monks, and fishermen were swept into the carnage. Villages were burned. Entire families were slaughtered. Women were bound with ropes, threaded through their hands, and dragged into the sea. Infants were thrown into flames. The horror was so deep that, generations later, parents in Fukuoka still use the phrase Mugura Kokuri. The Mongols and Koreans are coming, to frighten children into obedience. It was not just a story, it was a scar carved into language itself. The survivors buried the fallen in vast mounds now known as Senzuka, the mounds of 1,000 souls. They stood as both graves and warnings, reminders that even in defeat, honor could not be erased. On parchment, the Mongols claimed victory. They had landed, conquered, and burned. But behind closed doors, the Yuan court was uneasy. The invasion had been slower and bloodier than expected. Small pockets of resistance had delayed their advance for days. The invincible army of Kublai Khan had faced not an army, but an idea, the conviction of men who would rather die standing than kneel. Reputation in a Mongol world was everything. It was fear, not armies, that made empires surrender before the first arrow flew. And for the first time, fear had failed them. For the Japanese, Tsushima was tragedy and revelation in equal measure. The island was lost, its people devastated, yet the stand of Sosukakuni became something larger than life, a symbol of what it meant to be samurai. His courage was recorded in clan chronicles, such as the Soikafu, and immortalized in illustrated war scrolls like the Moko Shurai Ekitoba, painted decades later. In them, we see the 80 riders still charging forward through clouds of smoke, arrows glinting like rain, their faces calm even in defeat. These scrolls were not mere art, they were national memory. They taught that resistance, even hopeless resistance, had meaning. That courage, not victory, was what defined a warrior. The aftermath of Tsushima transformed Japan itself. The Kamakura shogunate, shaken by what had happened, finally grasped the scale of the danger. Across Kyushu, orders went out. Fortifications were raised along Hakata Bay, miles of stone and earth walls known as the Genko Borui. Watchtowers were built, troops were drilled. For the first time in its history, Japan prepared for total war. When the Mongols returned in 1281, their fleet was twice as large, a floating city of invasion. But this time, Japan was ready. The samurai stood behind walls, organized, disciplined, united by the memory of Tsushima's fallen. The beach that had once been their grave would now be their fortress. And then came the storm. A typhoon, vast, howling, merciless, tore across the sea, smashing the Mongol fleet to splinters. Thousands drowned. Ships vanished beneath black waves. The Japanese called it Kamikaze, the divine wind. To them, it was not coincidence. It was the hand of the gods, the final chapter written by the spirits of Tsushima's dead. Their sacrifice had not been in vain. It had summoned a storm that would defend Japan itself. The Battle of Tsushima was, in scale, a massacre, but in meaning, it was a birth. It forged an identity that would define Japan for centuries. The belief that courage outweighs conquest, that even in defeat, dignity can endure. The 80 samurai who rode into the Mongol horde that morning became more than soldiers. They became symbols of loyalty, of faith, and of the will to fight when the outcome is already written. Their story passed from father to son, painted on scrolls, whispered in prayers, carved into graves. And when future generations spoke of Japan's divine protection, they remembered where it began, on a small island in the cold November sea, where 80 men once stood against the empire of the world and proved that spirit can outlast steel.